Hey everybody, this is Dale with Networking Step by Step, and in today's video cheat sheet we're going to generate a default route into an OSPF area. First we're going to start off with doing some show commands to see if there's a default route already floating around in OSPF. Then we're going to propagate a default route into an OSPF area, and then do some verification show commands to see if our changes made any difference. So let's look at the network topology. We're going to propagate a default route from the area border routers here at router 3 and 4 down into OSPF area 2. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's look at router 5. Do a show IP route to see if there's already a default route in OSPF, and there's not. So there's two ways to propagate there's several ways to propagate a default route into OSPF, but we're going to use the default information originate method of propagating a default route, and there's two types of ways to do that. On router 3 we're going to use the command default information originate. So let's go over to router 3. Once again, you do this on the area border router. So let's go back over to router 5 where we did a show IP route 0.0.0.0 earlier looking for the default route, and let's see if it's there now. And it's still not, so either I'm not being patient enough or something's not right. Well, with the default information originate command, just that command right there, it will not originate a default route unless it already has one in its routing table. So we need to add this statement right here, a default route pointing to null 0, to coax router 3 into advertising that default route. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so we've pointed this default route to null 0, which is just a bit bucket. And let's go back to 5 and see if it has the default route now. And there it does. And it sees router 3, it's going to send it straight up the link between router 5 and router 3, and it sees router 3 as the originator of that route. So that's one way to do it. Now let's look at the other way to do it. Let's go to router 6 and do a show IP route for the default route. And it has it from 3. See that? It sees the one that's originating from 3. But we want to originate a default route from router 4, and we're going to use a little bit different method. Before we used the default information originate, and then we had to use the static route. We had to coax it in. We had to put a static default route into the table so that it would advertise. Now this would also work if it was receiving it in some other way, like let's say via BGP, and then if you have the default information originate command, it would then advertise it out. We're going to do a default information originate always, no matter what, whether you have another default route in your routing table anywhere, doesn't matter, you go ahead and you advertise a default route. This is the method I actually prefer. So once again, we use the always keyword to always advertise a default route. So let's go back to router 6. So before, router 6 had the default route from router 3. And now it has the default route via router 4. So router 5 prefers the default route from router 3 because that's its closest gateway. And router 6 prefers the default route from router 4 because that's its closest gateway. So those are the two ways that I prefer to originate a default route into an OSPF area. Once again, the default information originate, and it will only advertise it if it has the default route in its routing table. So we used a static default in this case, and then it started advertising it. Or on router 4, we did a default information originate always advertise it, whether you have a default route in your routing table, just advertise it anyway. So, and that's the way that I actually prefer. So that's how you generate a default route into OSPF.